Well, good morning. Welcome as ever to History Matters. And coffee really does today. I've got like the world's biggest mug. Okay, thank you very much. Mugs are of anything, I guess, maybe you're welcome. Maybe tea or coffee are preferred. Today we're going to be talking about a topic that really obviously grew out of last week's hearing, which partly has to do with militias and what a militia is and what it was and what people are making it into today. So that's basically what I want to talk about. And I want to mostly focus on early America. We're going to get a New Haven moment. And then at the end, as I always do, sort of segue back and talk a little bit about what this suggests about the current day. But before I do that, I shall turn to my partner in crime, Annie, and ask her to tell us something about the rules of the game.
Well, good morning, everybody. I'm Annie Evans. I am the Director of Education at New American History. I'm delighted to be with our friend Joanne and our friends at the National Council for History Education. If you didn't turn in super early, John was mentioning that if you go to the conversations page today, the registration will go live later for free for the Equity Summit. They've been doing that the last couple of years. So
Wow.
John would invite you to register. They have not announced the lineup yet of speakers or whatever, but it's going to be fabulous because it's been great the last 2 years. So please take a look at that page, the same place where you go to find the link for this morning's conversation. I'll be here with you and I will be monitoring the Q&A. The chat is already lit up. So as always, we have a lot of our friends in our community making comments, sharing links in the chat. But if you have a question, it's got to go in the Q&A because that's where we will look for it when Joanne is done talking. All right, take it away, Joanne. We're excited.
Okay, okie dokie. So I did, in preparing this morning and trying to figure out what I wanted to say to you, I did a thing that I very often do, which sounds obvious, but possibly isn't. Let me change once again every time. That I do all the time when I'm writing and doing my work, even for things that appear to be really, really obvious, and that is look up definitions, right? And ideally, I'll go to the Oxford English Dictionary, the OED, and they give you, even though it's an English and not American dictionary, they give you how, over different periods of time, how one word is used or not used, and you can get a sense, well, I may think this means X today, but look at that, in 1780 it meant Y. I did not get into the OED, but I just very briefly was like, well, how can I talk about this without at least checking the dictionary? So I looked up, and this is, I'm not going to shame the dictionary that did this, but this is in one dictionary entry. So it had two definitions of what a militia was. Definition number one, a military force that is raised from the civil population to supplement a regular army in an emergency. Definition number two, a military force that engages in rebel or terrorist activities in opposition to a regular army. So apparently a militia either joins with the army or is against the army. And in that sense, probably is either with the government or against the government. And that's really not handy. So, but those, like literally A and B were the definitions of militia. And that raises a point, and it's an important point, which I'll come back to. But that is, in a lot of ways, there's a lot of contention over how people define militia. And I think that's partly because, and this is partly what I'll talk about today, because they have always been a kind of, militias have always been a kind of in-between, not even say military force, military organization for local security and protection. And because they're localized and because they're often, in some cases, unofficial, and because sometimes they would like train seasonally, but it's very much part-time. For all of these things that started out in early America and have evolved and changed over time, sometimes it means it's really hard to define militia. And I think in the modern day, it means something different from where it started. Now, generally speaking, we can say that a militia very long-standing, right? Goes all the way back to colonial days, American colonial days. It's a British tradition. One way or another, it's a civilian armed force and localized. So a localized civilian armed force. Generally speaking, the idea was, and there are some sweeping generalizations I can't make because this was so localized and there were variations, but generally speaking, able-bodied men between 16 and 60 were required to, in one way or another, be in the militia. Now, this sort of thing is not necessarily enforced, but this at least is the rule. And anyone who was able-bodied and was going to serve in the militia, meaning a civilian force ready in case of emergency, they had to have a musket, they had to have some form of ammunition, and they had to be ready in these early years to fight against, I don't know, the French, to attack Native Americans, I don't know. But one way or another, the idea of a militia in this period was American citizens, well, not American citizens, British subjects of different colonies who were ready to rise up if they needed to be there in an emergency to defend their government, their local area. It was, I don't want to say it's quite like a National Guard, but it was very much a part-time civilian thing that typically speaking, there would be militia musters a couple of times a year. And more than anything else, they were great parading moments, right? There would be marching around in uniforms, and part of it was supposed to be practicing so that they could act in some way or another like a unified force. And very often that would be at like a court day, so which generally is a festivity day because it's one of the rare days that brings people in from all over the place to vote or to take part in the court. So generally speaking, that's what a militia was: able-bodied civilians who joined together and for the most part, or at least were supposed to, own or have access to a weapon. They didn't all, as I'm saying, this is very murky, some definitions here that meant on occasional training days just to kind of remind themselves of what they might have to do if there came to be a battle. Now, I want to offer you a sense, actually, before I do that, let me talk to you a little bit about militias and why the idea of that came to be particularly important in the United States after the colonial period, when we really are the United States. And there are two reasons that are related as to why militias continued to have real prominence for a while in American history. One reason is the Republican small r ideal, right? And Jefferson is the person who, gave this words more than once and didn't always use the phrase yeoman farmers, but the idea that you have these independent farmers who are ready to rise up and defend their land and their colony/country when they're needed. And then when they're done doing that, they go back to their farm and back to work. And that was not just Jeffersonian, but that certainly was something that Jefferson talked about time and again, that's the best thing you can have is local independent people who obviously will rise up and defend what's theirs and then go home and go back to their independent farms. So that was an ideal, right? That was the idea, was citizen soldiers. Americans had a lot of feelings about standing armies. One of them had to do with their interaction with the British just recently, before the United States was the United States. But also the general idea of a standing army was also scary to early Americans, because the idea of a standing army was an organized permanent force that is not a civil organization. It's a military government organization. And when you have a standing army, it could rise up and turn against either the government or you. You no longer have power over that kind of an army. So it's first of all, can be a weapon. And secondly, it's the sort of thing that can corrupt or enlarge government in unpredictable ways. So meaning if you want to have a standing army, you can find reasons to use it, and then you find reasons to use it, and then you spend money, and then because you're spending money, you raise taxes, and the American people pay the taxes, then you do it all over again. So there were fears about a standing army. There was concern about what a standing army implied or could do. And there was this Republican ideal that citizen soldiers standing up for what's theirs. And I will add, given that I know there are a lot of teachers here, part of why Jefferson spoke so often about the importance of education, of everyone being, well, everyone, white men of a certain kind being educated, but not just the elite, was because in his mind, and again, not just him, if you were going to be a well-armed, meaning not just with guns, American citizen, you needed to recognize threats that were going to cause you to have to rise up and defend government, your state, or what's yours. So education was partly pragmatic, right? You need to, it's part of why he wanted people to study history, right? You need to understand your government, your country, and what the biggest threats to it are, so that you will recognize them and can rise up and then go back to your farm. So all of that is woven together. For all of those reasons, there's not really a standing army in the United States for a while. What you have initially are lots of militia units that are localized, that are state run, sometimes independent, sometimes officially connected in one way to the government. And I want to give you an example of that, just to partly to show you the in-betweenness of the militia and what it can be, and how you can apply different terms to it. And I know I've talked about, or think I've talked about, someone will tell me, about the Battle of New Haven before, in 1775, I believe. Hang on, I will get the precise date of the Battle of New Haven, to be precise. But of course, my notes aren't organized, so I won't be telling you that. At any rate, the Battle of New Haven. But this is before the Battle of New Haven. I've talked about the Battle of New Haven before. I've talked about people in New Haven organizing and parading around and trying to train themselves in case they were going to need to fight. And there was one man who I remember reading was like in the yard area of his house, sort of training on a horse in case he had to do like horse maneuvers under battle. So these are people who are self-organizing in case they're needed. Go back in time a little bit, and here we are in 1774 in New Haven, and a group of men get together. It's 1774, so things are starting to be concerning as far as the British Army and what Britain is doing, and the colonists. So a bunch of people in New Haven get together and decide to create some kind of a military company. And I want to read their statement. So this is their explanation of what they're doing. This is December 28th, 1774. They say, as we, the subscribers, are desirous to encourage the military art in the town of New Haven, and in order to have a well-disciplined, there's a blank here in the original form, so it might say militia, I don't know, it's actually a blank. Company, let's say that, a well-disciplined company in said town have agreed to teach us the military exercise for the consideration of £3 lawful money, blah, blah, blah. It's a long statement about what they're going to wear and what they're going to train, and they want to be an organized force, and they need to know the military art, and they're going to even hire someone at their own expense so that they know how to behave in an effective manner in case they're needed during warfare. So this is privately done, right? This is a group of citizens or subjects still who are organizing this because they think it may be needed, and it's 1774. In 1775, they ask the government of Connecticut to formally make them a state-related or still colony-related unit. They apply to be the governor's second company of guards. They want to be officially recognized. They make a statement that says, we're paying for this out of our own pockets. Like, we deserve to be recognized as something official. And they are, right? They're given some kind of an official status, but you're getting a sense of the slightly free and easy manner in what we're talking about here. So then news of the Battle of Lexington gets to New Haven. And this I love. I've talked about this in my American Revolution course. When something really noteworthy, striking, wonderful, horrible happens in your life, you often remember exactly where you were when it happened, or even precisely the time, right? I was sitting outside of the mailroom at an ad agency answering phones when I heard that the Challenger exploded, which is actually true. So, you tend to remember very specific details. And when you're doing that, in a sense, you're marking that event was something that stunned you at the time enough to stay in some way or another in your memory. So in the case of New Haven, what you get is someone saying that the Battle of Lexington, news arrived at New Haven, quote, on Friday, the 21st of April, about noon, which I love. I love the immediacy of that, right? That's someone saying, it was right around noon when we heard that. And we remember, right? Years later, we remember that was around noon that the news came. So, and I've talked before, I think I've talked before about Powderhouse Day. I'm looking to see, but I'm going to act like maybe I have and people don't remember, or maybe I haven't. I'll be very brief. What I'm going to describe to you here is the origin of something that New Haven celebrates every year on the 21st of April, which is Powderhouse Day. Something's going on out there, which I learned about from a taxi driver in New Haven when I said I teach the American Revolution, and he said, "Oh, well, then you must know all about Powderhouse Day." So Powderhouse Day, it's a local holiday in New Haven, and it celebrates Benedict Arnold. And so the story here of Powderhouse Day is when the news of Lexington gets to New Haven, Arnold is part of this company that was made, get the official title here, the Governor's Second Company of Guards. He was elected captain of that. He calls out his unit, his group, his men, and he wants to immediately go to Lexington to join whatever's up there, whoever's fighting up there. We need to rise up and we need to go up there and fight and defend the colonists against the British Army. I mean, the British Army is firing on British subjects. How is this possible? Imagine the shock of that. So that's part of what you're capturing here. So Arnold wants to immediately take his men and go north. And about 40, it says here, about 40 of them. So a chunk of the people who are in this unit agree that they're going to do it, but they had no ammunition. So Arnold then marches his company to the Powderhouse. Well, actually, no, I take that back. I'm like all revved up on coffee, guys. Marches his army to where the selectmen, the government officials in the town were sitting, sets his troop up in front of the door of this government assembly, and basically says, if you don't give me the keys to the Powderhouse, you're going to be sorry. We will break it open. We will take ammunition ourselves. You better give us the keys. And they do. And Arnold's men arm themselves and they head up to Lexington. Now, Powderhouse Day, every year in New Haven, they celebrate that moment. And there is still the Governor's Second Company of Guards still exists. And they are the ones who reenact this every year. And they form, they come into the town green, the middle of town, and they first set themselves up in front of City Hall or some part of City Hall as troops, right? And then the guy playing Benedict Arnold steps up and says his line, right? I demand that you give us the keys to the Powderhouse so we can go and fight in the Battle of Lexington. I watched it one year, I went to see it. And the guy playing Benedict Arnold gets up on the stoop and he makes very dramatic, right? I demand the keys to the Powderhouse so that we can go and fight at the Battle of, he couldn't remember. And his men behind him are like, Lexington, it's Lexington. And some actual modern government official comes out and he's like, here have the keys. Can we stop this now? And then they parade in their original kind of uniforms up and down the town green. And it's a whole thing. They fire a cannon. Anyway, the point of that whole story is to give you a sense of the sort of, immediate, somewhat informal, not always well-defined nature of some of what we use or think of. We use the word militia and assume it's something clear. There's a lot of fuzziness in what a militia is, except for the fact that it's a civilian force. And generally speaking, I think in the past, they would have assumed that it was something that was going to help defend against enemies to a colony or state. I think the modern meaning ends up being shifted, but we'll come back to that. Newbie is very worked up. Noobs. It's like flapping its wings. I'm sorry, Newbie. Okay, so with all of that in mind, let me then refer you to two clauses of the Constitution. Not the Second Amendment, but two clauses of the Constitution. So Article 1 of the Constitution is about the legislative branch. Section 8 is about its enumerated powers. So Article 1, Section 8, Clause 15 says, the Congress shall have power to provide for calling forth the militia to execute the laws of the Union, suppress insurrections, and repel invasions. Okay, so Congress can call forth the militia if it needs to execute laws or suppress insurrections. It also says Congress shall have power to provide for organizing, arming and disciplining the militia and for governing such part of them as newbie, as may be employed in the service of the United States, reserving to the states, respectively, the appointment of the officers and the authority of training the militia according to the discipline prescribed by Congress. Okay, so here what we have is the Constitution saying, well, Congress, if we need for some reason to call militia, Congress has the power to do that. What they're referring to there very clearly is what I just described, right? That when they say we can call the militia, they mean these guys who come together a couple of times of year, who train, who are there as a kind of citizen force to defend things locally, and they parade around a couple of times a year, and they're supposed to have guns. They don't all necessarily do, but there it is. So now let us turn to the Second Amendment, which says a well-regulated militia, being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Think about the amendment in light of what I just told you, and I'm sure many of you have done this before, but when you directly draw the line, right, that a well-regulated militia has a very specific meaning, even though the lines around it are all blurry. What the amendment is saying is, well, of course, we need a well-regulated militia to defend states and defend the United States. And because we need that, people need to be able to have guns, right? So that's what it's saying. That's what Second Amendment is saying. People who just focus on the second half, that the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Well, yeah, that's part of the sentence. It's there, but it's there for a reason. Now, I'm actually not saying, and would never say, that we need to go back to what the founders said and say, oh, they meant this and thus we can never. That's not what I'm saying. But what I am saying is, number one, historical context matters when you're looking at and interpreting things. Number two, the meanings of things evolve and change over time, including the way people have interpreted and understood things in the Constitution. So in essence, pointing at this and saying it justifies what we want it to mean today is interesting, but it has nothing to do with what was wanted initially, and it has everything to do with what people want now. And that's important. We've talked about this a lot of times before, that one of the important reasons to be looking at history and understanding history now, and it's in the last few years ever more in the limelight, is, and again, Jefferson wanting people to be educated and understand history so they can recognize threats. History is vitally important because history teaches you, among other things, supposedly it should, I know you guys it does, but not everywhere, the nature of your government, how it runs, what's allowable, what's not allowable, how things were understood originally. how the government generally runs, ways in which over time it hasn't worked that way, and all of those variations, how important it is to understand the variations and evolutions that lead to the modern moment. The Second Amendment, because it's about guns and because Americans have such strong feelings about guns, gets interpreted in all kinds of interesting ways. But if you're going to look forward in time and read it rather than looking back in time, if you're looking forward in time, what they're thinking about is, well, of course we need a well-regulated militia. I mean, we don't have an army, right? We don't have a standing army. So we definitely need a well-regulated militia. That's the context of the Second Amendment. So what was interesting to me, I don't know, obviously this topic came up from I guess it was Tuesday's hearing from the January 6th committee. And at one time, I can't remember when, it was when one of the witnesses was testifying. Now I can't remember his name, a very long last name, someone out there will know. The former member of the Oath Keepers. He said that the leader of the Oath Keepers was obsessed with the Insurrection Act of 1807, which, of course, as a historian watching this, I was like, wait a minute. Like, really? Like the head of the Oath Keepers is like, now let's look at the Insurrection Act of 1807. History becomes really important when it helps you do something that you want to do and maybe shouldn't be doing. The Insurrection Act of 1807 said that the president had the power to call militias to put down unrest or insurrection. To the head of the Oath Keepers, that's where he was going. Okay, then, the president can, call forth the militias to put down insurrection. Interesting, definition of militia, what it is or what it isn't. Again, modern understandings and earlier understandings aren't necessarily the same. And they're like, I'm pointing to that there. Look at that if we need to, the president can call the militia to put down American citizens. This becomes complicated over time, and I won't go into that. But that's what was being referred to during the hearing, that the leader, close this up here, that the leader of the Oath Keepers was very much looking at that act from 1807 as a way to justify the fact that this former President Trump, could call them up and send them out and basically give them power, and they could do whatever they wanted to do. For one thing, that definitely shows you how things evolve over time, the current context for that versus the original context for that. Again, think early America, no standing army. But the fact that people, certainly Oath Keepers, were reckoning with early American legislation to figure out how they could do what they wanted to do, it shows in some ways the ways in which the kind of, I guess, amorphousness of militia it can be handy and dangerous at the same time. There was a lot of talk in that hearing as well about whether or not the Oath Keepers felt that they were a militia. And again, that same witness said something like, well, they deny that they're a militia, but they're a militia, they're a dangerous militia. And by that, I think what they were saying was, so first of all, the logic doesn't mesh, but whatever. In this case, I think what they're saying is, well, no, we're not a militia because that implies we're a military force. We're not a military force. We're just a group that gets together and trains, right? We're not a militia. That's a military organization, except maybe we are a militia because we really are interested in that Insurrection Act. At any rate, what all of this is showing is that, first of all, militias, to understand what they are, you really do have to focus on the fact that people didn't want and didn't trust a standing army. So militias had a big role. They fought alongside the Continental Army during the Revolution, and they remained important forces for a long time. When the United States was partway, not quite, in a war with France in the late 1790s, 1798, one of the issues that people were discussing was, maybe we should raise an army. Like maybe we need an army. And there are actually, Hamilton was made, I want to say, Inspector General of the Army. And he was a happy camper, like, yes, I'm in charge of an army. But you see in his papers these lists of people he's considering to be officers in this army. And he has the name and then what he thinks is right or wrong with them. You know, John Smith seems to drink a lot. Joseph Wells, like fine, upstanding man. At any rate, here we are in a quasi-war with France, and people are like, maybe we need an army. So that's the context for militia in the past. The context for militia in the present is entirely different. And in a sense, it's the word that's a big part of the problem. The word connects people mentally, sort of imaginatively, to like this tradition in American history. But words have meanings that change over time. And everyone wants to connect with the founding in some way. And as we've said, or certainly as I've said, I see I'm already a little over time. As I've said any number of times, right? You can always find a quote from the founding to back up what you want to say. The real key is what are they actually saying in context and what are they trying to say? This is more of that too. This is more of the creative shaping of what happens in this period so that you can claim it for your own. Again, another reason why it's so important to teach history and to teach it fully and to teach it accurately and not to shave away the parts that don't immediately serve your interest. Okay. I think that's most of what I wanted to say, and I've gone over anyway. I could have talked about Shays' Rebellion, and I didn't, but if you want me to, I could go back, because that's another example of militias seeming to people like dangerously uncontrollable, but I'll stop. I haven't seen, I just probably haven't looked at the mug.
Oh, they're asking. They're asking.
Okay, there I see the mug. If there's anyone here who's new, what week is this?
119.
119. So this is the 119th week we've been doing this. And every week I have a mug that in some way reflects what we're talking about. I do not have 119 mugs. And as a matter of fact, today I was like, I used this one too recently. This one has more to do with the fact that people don't understand or don't want to understand the Second Amendment. Oops, there's my lipstick. Let me get that off there. And it's a James Madison quote. And this came from someone out there. I am really bad. I don't know if it's on the Slate list, but this is, someone gave me the mug. It's a James Madison quote, and it says, "The advancement and diffusion of knowledge is the only guardian of true liberty." And I picked that because true knowledge, as in really understanding what we're talking about when we talk about history and thinking about what we mean when we're talking about militias, when we're using that word in the present and what we're assuming about the past. So that is my mug choice.
That's a nice big mug too.
No, it's dangerous, isn't it?
Yeah, I love it. So okay. The chat has been lit up. For some reason, my chat is disabled. John and I can't figure it out. So I couldn't play in the chat, but that's okay because Q&A is also lit up. So if you're okay, I'm going to jump right into the first question. Okay. This comes from our friend Dave. Dave says, regardless of the definition, who commands the militia and how are they funded and how has that changed over time? So he's looking for funding and who gets put in charge.
Again, in the case of Connecticut, it's private citizens, and then they're like, can we be official with the governor? And they're given some kind of official role. If they are, in many cases, I think they get connected with the local government in some way, and I think then the local government helps pay. In the petition that Benedict Arnold's troops make to the governor of Connecticut, saying we want to be a troop, one of the things they say is, we're paying for this all out of our own pockets. Like, come on, So again, this is really localized when we're talking about militias. Really localized. There are accounts of during the revolution of people seeing different militias from different places show up in one area, like getting ready for a battle, and they're like all dressed differently, and some are wearing hunting shirts, and some have like weird rifles, and it's just like local guys who have been working in that locality with cohort of people to do what they want to do, and then suddenly they're all coming together, and you get a real visual sense of the way in which these are really independent bodies.
Almost like Neighborhood Watch in the beginning.
Maybe. I don't know if they're parading around and drilling, but
And also Dale and Bess think they both sent you that mug, so you might have two of them.
I do have two.
Okay, well, they're from Dale and Bess. So
Okay, thank you, Dale and Bess. I do have two, as a matter of fact, and they're huge.
Yeah. So
good,
if
I'm
anyone
glad
wants
then.
that mug, I live 45 minutes from Orange County, where Montpelier is. I can just send y'all one. Okay, so Dale has several questions.
Mhm.
So I'll try and sprinkle a little Dale in between other people's questions. So here's the first one from Dale. What was the difference between militia and the Minutemen? Was one considered regular and the other more spontaneous?
Minutemen were more elite than militia. They were trained better and more specifically than militia. They were supposed to be ready, at a minute's notice. So they were related, but kind of elite. So militias weren't necessarily, militia members were not necessarily Minutemen. Minutemen in some way or another came from the militias, but it was the elite force. They were something apart.
Kind of the Navy SEALs of that era.
See, I can't. I
don't know.
Scrolling down military avenues, I'm like, yeah.
I don't deal with military either. Like I try to avoid. Okay. And many people mentioned in the chat that Newbie is a pacifist. So they're assigning Newbie political persuasions in the chat. You might want to make sure that Newbie's okay with that. Okay, this one comes from.
Yeah.
Yeah. Whenever you would say militia, he would start chirping really loud. So we were like, whoa.
I didn't notice the timing. Okay.
So someone said the word militia is a trigger for Newbie.
Clearly, militia. He just said BBBB. Okay.
He's drunk on millet. Okay, so Francesca says, has the creation of the modern, like current National Guard or standing army made militias now completely obsolete?
Before we get to that, I do see Lawrence saying I wouldn't go that far about Minutemen. Yeah, I don't mean to say that they're like, doo, 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 they're just better trained than regular Minutemen. So that's a good qualifier. I'm sorry, then go back and ask me the question.
Yeah. So Francesca asked, has the creation of our National Guard or standing army made militias completely obsolete now?
No, I don't think so. I mean, I think locally, again, there are still, I mean, nowadays, actually part of what I'll say is think about the National Guard, right? Which is part-time and people train a little, and then I don't think it's made militias obsolete. I just think we understand the spectrum of armed forces that we have differently, and I think the National Guard partly takes up some of that space, but I think in one way or another where people feel that there needs to be locally organized, local people who can do something on the spot, in addition to people who can be called by the federal government and serve wherever. So I don't think that it's obsolete, but it's definitely not like the central way of defending anything now. It's again, it's morphed into other things, and parts of it have drifted away.
Yeah, as a kid, I always thought that they only came when we had a hurricane. Like, because that's who comes out and does the sandbag.
That's true. That's when you hear about the National Guard. That's absolutely true.
That's what I thought it was when I was little. Okay, so Miranda is asking, is the Insurrection Act what gave JFK the power to federalize National Guard in the 60s?
Oh, hang on a sec. I have the act. Okay. So in the National Defense Act of 1916, under that act, the militia, which still had been almost a purely state institution, was brought under the control of the national government. The term militia of the United States was defined to comprehend all able-bodied male citizens, blah, blah, blah. And that act helped reorganize the National Guard. So that act doesn't explicitly grant Kennedy the power, but it does connect militias with the national government in a way. It's a big question, and it still is, and we've seen it throughout the most recent presidency, right? What counts as an emergency or an insurrection? And can a president call maybe not the US Army, but other kinds of troops in, and should they? Can a president or should a president call on troops to fight other Americans? I'm not going to go into the 19th century discussion of this, but there was a whole 19th century discussion of this. It's like, no, we should not be able to assign American troops to fight and shoot at other Americans. So it's, again, it's a little fuzzy.
Yeah, and that kind of goes with Gloria's next question. So Gloria's asked, is Shays' rebellion a legitimate use of the militia?
Well, so that's interesting. So Shays' rebellion, for those who need, I'll give you the quick and dirty version. So Shays' rebellion, it happens a couple of years before the Constitutional Convention. It's part of people who wanted a Constitutional Convention very much were like, and this is why. There were a number of farmers in, I think, Western Massachusetts who were having problems paying taxes, who felt that the government was coming down on them too hard, who petitioned in some way to say, hey, we're having a problem here, and they were not heard. And so a Revolutionary War veteran named Daniel Shays gets together a bunch of people, right, who are armed and ready to fight, and they close down the courts, and it spreads. So it starts out in Massachusetts, it's a little bit in New Hampshire, a little bit in Connecticut, and they're protesting about the fact that the taxes are too high, that there's no way to do anything about it, and they're just gonna, and people are being brought to court and declared, essentially bankrupt and put in debtor's prison. So they're attacking the system for that reason. What's interesting about Shays' Rebellion is here too, right? The sort of blurriness of the militia. So this is private citizens, farmers who get together for this purpose. Initially, when it becomes clear that this is a thing and it's spreading, and there doesn't seem to be a way to control it, right? People go to the Continental Congress and they say, guys, there's like a rebellion happening up here in another state. Continental Congress, please help us do something. And combination of things, Continental Congress doesn't / can't. And there are some people in the Continental Congress who feel this is a Massachusetts issue. Meanwhile, in Massachusetts, some of the official militia who would have been called in to attack the Shays rebels actually agreed with the Shays rebels. So they're not going to march on the Shays rebels. And what ends up shutting down Shays' rebellion is they create, I don't know how many very wealthy merchants in Massachusetts join up together and with their own money create essentially a private army to put down Shays' rebellion. So, which shows how complicated it is to answer the question, is that a formal use of militia? Well, the militia was called on to do something that they wouldn't, because they, in a sense, were related in some way to what the Shays rebels were doing. And they clearly didn't think that was appropriate for them to be put in that situation. There's a long tradition, with or without militia, there's a long tradition of, this is the beginning of the American Revolution, of Americans, or at this point, British subjects, upset about something and going through formal channels. We're going to write a petition. We're going to send someone to Parliament. We're going to do all the official things to protest. And after that all fails, that's when British subjects / Americans, that's when they're like, okay, like we have no path now. Now things are going to get more dramatic. And that's a pattern. It's not as though generally speaking, I mean, Benedict Arnold and his men maybe are one example, but generally speaking, colonists tended to first try through regular channels and then get frustrated and feel like their voice wasn't being heard and burst outside of that bound. So calling the militia to get the rebellion suppressed, yeah. Having the militia in some cases have problems doing that, yeah. It all shows you the fuzziness and the locality, and in this case, the inability to really control it because it's a private army that suppresses the rebellion. And you can understand why a lot of people pointed to that as a reason why there needed to be a stronger government than the Confederation Congress, that there needed to be a new, stronger, more centralized national government, leads to the Constitutional Convention. There are all kinds of people, certainly Hamilton's in there, George Washington, any number of other people, a lot of them people who had, in one way or another, been involved at headquarters during the American Revolution and had seen also the inability of the Continental Congress to really do things in a broad sweeping way during a time of war. Shays' Rebellion was like, it's what's leapt into my mind. I apologize, like the final nail in the coffin. I know it's horrible to use when you're talking about the military, but for these people, it was like, well, look at this. Like basically there's an uprising and we can't do anything. We can't do anything about it. What does this mean? Like chaos. By this point in time, and a lot of things happen in the 1780s, Americans are saying, yeah, okay, they're not saying, you know what, we need a better army. They're saying there is no control over what's going on here. We need a stronger government. So it's some of the fuzziness over militias helps push things towards the federal convention.
So oddly enough, Elizabeth wants you to know that she is a direct descendant of someone who was a leader at Shays' Rebellion.
Wow. Can we have this person's name?
She'll have to put it in the chat. Clint wants everyone to know that he found a link before Tim. That almost never happens. No one finds a link before Tim. So now we've dubbed ourselves the Links Militia because we can get the links out there fast.
Wow. You guys are quick. You are.
Okay. The ancestor's name is, it says Job or Job Shattuck. So okay. Interesting. All right. So
very cool.
Yep. Here got a couple more from Dale and one more from Gloria. And then if anybody else puts one in, if we have time. Dale's next question: was it common practice for local elites to purchase commissions in their local militia? Just buy your way in.
I don't think militias had formal commissions like that. You know, I don't think it was like, I want to be a general in the militia army. I think certainly during the Revolution with the Continental Army, like people from foreign countries, for example, were coming to the soon-to-be United States in part because they knew if they showed up and they looked fancy and they were from Europe, they would be given a position as an officer. So there was that kind of jockeying going on. But I don't think militias operated the same way. And you had officers largely, well, not everywhere, but often being elected into positions of power. So it's more complicated than that. It's a good question, though.
That's interesting because it makes me think of in the last few months, we've seen a lot of American, not a lot, but a good number of American military, either current or retired, going over to help fight in Ukraine. You know, we see stories on the news, like, you know, some of our veterans have gone over there because they just felt this need to help.
Right. People. Exactly. Or Americans. It's true. I've heard about that more than once. Now I have to read something only because Keith says, I know a scholar working on Shays' Rebellion who might like to speak to you.
Well, they're going to have to look at the recording.
Like this makes you feel like, uh-oh. Somehow or other. So you can tell me that that's not a threat.
Yeah.
But at any rate, let's
all right. We got about 3 more questions. Okay, this is Gloria's next one, and I apologize, Gloria, if I'm mispronouncing this person's name. Jack Rakov. Yeah, said that the militia and the Second Amendment was a way to guarantee a Republican form of government. Is that a credible idea? The militia and the Second Amendment is a way to help guarantee a Republican form.
Yeah, well, certainly it's in several ways, but in one important way, it's connected to the idea of not having a standing army that, for example, could side with someone who wants to be a dictator. And, you know, there are any number of paths into tyranny, dictatorship, or anarchy, which were the spectrum of horrors for people in the early republic. So certainly that was part of the connection.
Yeah. Dave is asking, could Congress pass a law that clearly defined what a militia is today? And if so, how would you define militia today?
Oh, wow. See, I wouldn't even attempt that, because I might sit here and say something, and I can guarantee you there are a lot of people who maybe, some of whom have let's say a spectrum of views about militias, who would define it differently. I think the fact that the witness testifying during the hearing said, you know, the Oath Keepers they pretend like they're not a militia, but they're a militia. In that case, he's clearly saying, well, it's a dangerous military unit of some kind. And that's how he's using it in that sense. I think other people would say 1776, right? Where like the original spirit of America, militias are getting together. And, you know, I might side with one over another, but I think, I don't think there's a formal definition. And I think because it's so wound up with American history and the tradition, revolutionary tradition, and because people, you know, they just yelling 1776 somehow or other, I'm militia, 1776 suggests that there's this nice long narrative thread connecting the present to the past in that way. Clearly, to say that that complicates how people define a militia is a major understatement. So I think, like many words that we've talked about over the course of the last bazillion episodes, this is another one in which the definition that we choose, how we define it and how we use it, can have an enormous impact, can really shape the legitimacy of things that are happening or the justification for things that are happening in a way that, again, that's a really good question, because it is important to think about how words are being used, which is where I started, right? First thing I do, go to the dictionary, you know, how was this understood? Because it truly, over the years, it can be mind-blowing sometimes, the ways in which you think you know what something means and you've assumed it forever. And, you know, by chance, you're like, I should have looked this up, and you do it, and you're like, oh my God, it changed my understanding of everything. So it's really important, and it would be interesting to track over time the use and misuse of just the idea of militia. Would be someone can have a project out there that would be really interesting.
Anissa loves linguistic history. Maybe we need a History Matters dictionary. We can start with contingency and militia and build it out from there.
And Clinton is right, words get co-opted.
Yes.
And particularly linked with history in a useful kind of a way. Now, you guys are talking about buying commissions and things in the Continental Army, I think is what I see going on here, I'm assuming.
Okay, there's one last question.
Okay.
If we answer one more question, we'll, for the first time ever, have answered all the questions. I don't think that's ever happened before.
Wow.
Dale says, it seems like militias were more well-known up in the New England area rather than the Southern colonies. He's asking, is that correct? And if so, why New England?
That's an interesting question. I mean, there were militias in the South. So it's not as though they were only in the North. I mean, I don't actually have an answer to that, I will guess, is that part of it has to do with closed in urban areas versus widespread rural areas, is that in
Population density.
And the fact that those would be places where people would get together and drill, and it would happen, you know, it'd be more visible. And also I think because like Virginia had a early organized militia, Massachusetts did too. And those are also in part because where does the revolution, when it begins, it's Virginia and Massachusetts that are very much at the core. So Massachusetts particularly, they're like up and ready to fight because so much is happening there with, you know, all of the various acts and resistance and everything else. And then finally Lexington and Concord, they have a tradition. It's comical, you know, when George Washington, Continental Congress or the Confederation Congress puts him in charge of whatever this new Continental Army is going to be. And he goes up to Massachusetts to begin this process of creating the army. And he's, you know, beams in on militia units there. And he's horrified, right? He's like, who are these guys? Like, how you can't control these guys. Actually, he says, I quote this all the time in my revolution course. He says, and this is not necessarily just about the militia, but it's a reflection of the militia. He says, and this is almost a direct quote, New Englanders are an exceeding dirty and nasty people. I always feel like, but you know, and the militia units in Massachusetts, they elect their officer, right? They're very much in the tradition of what comes to be, you know, colonial tradition of what we organize ourselves, we control our government. If you're trying to create an army, the sort of, well, we decide who has power mode is not going to be really helpful, right? So there are all kinds of reasons why it's really difficult to sort of get at least some militia units incorporated into the Continental Army. And then there are other militia units that remain militia, fight alongside the Continental Army, aren't necessarily controllable, but still do a lot of things, are present as manpower at important moments, are collecting supplies and doing other things. So, but all of this was part of the trials and tribulations of just trying to, have some kind of an army at a moment when, you're under attack by, one of the finest armies on the face of the earth.
Yeah. So we just had a question pop up. I thought we were going to clear but anyway, but it says anonymous attendee, John. I didn't know we could join anonymously, but it's a question that seems like it's not, Zoom bomb or anything. They're asking to comment on Carol Anderson's take that the Second Amendment was only added to the Bill of Rights to get the South to ratify, and that the South wanted to be able to prevent slave revolt. So that was why the whole Second Amendment thing. Do you want to comment on that one?
Well, I think there are a lot of reasons why one would say that, the Second Amendment came about. I certainly think the South, as Carol says, were things that in one way or another affected slavery. They were, one of the things about Southerners, and this is true for a huge chunk of early American history and Congress, the period I wrote about, is that if something happens that seems to jeopardize slavery, they're a block, they're a unit. They just like, boop, we're gone. I don't think that is the cause of the Second Amendment. I don't disagree with Carol. I might just shift orders of things, but to say that it's involved in the South and to say that there are racial implications, yeah, I would totally agree with that.
All right, we literally did it, kids. We cleared the Q&A.
At the precise moment.
Yes.
Oh, and I will say, actually, Richard says this. So what this person, anonymous person, was referring to is a live episode of the podcast I do with Heather Cox Richardson now and then, which came out on Tuesday in audio form and eventually will be posted online in video form, in which we talked about the Second Amendment and race. And we talked about a lot of these issues. Carol talked a lot about this idea about militias and certainly their use in patrolling and putting down in one way or another slave rebellion. So I highly recommend it. We had a lot of fun, and I think it was a really good and important conversation.
And I think someone's already, Tim's already put the link in the chat.
Of course, because you're the link Minutemen. Yes, and Carol Anderson's book, The Second, on the Second Amendment, also excellent, and that's part of what we were talking about initially in our conversation. So I recommend all of that highly.
All right, well, I think it's time to segue, Joanne.
It is time to segue. Exactly on the dot, time to segue. Okay, so I will say what I need to say at this moment, which is, first of all, thank you all, as ever, for coming here on a Friday morning and engaging in democracy, the process of conversation and debating things and asking questions and figuring out answers, and thinking about the connection of the past with the present. All of these things are so important. And here we are every Friday for a bazillion weeks, which is my way of conveniently forgetting the number and then not having to remember it. 119, thank you. I'm just gonna say billion. At any rate, our doing this for this long is a tribute to the importance of this kind of thing at this particular moment when democracy really needs to be protected. So thank you for being here on a Friday morning and engaging in democracy. We will now segue to the after party. What that means is that we will turn off the stop recording, turn off the camera. It's like, bye. We will stop recording so that we can be a little freer and easier in whatever we want to talk about. If you are on Facebook and would like to join the after party, you need to leave Facebook, and instead you need to beam in through the website, the link that people use to get here online, which is ncheteach.org/conversations. So if you're on Facebook and want to join us, please do. Who knows where our conversation will go? But we're gonna, someone, you guys with the bingo, someone says, did Joanne say podcast? For those who don't know, people play bingo based on what I do or don't say. And it has made it very difficult for me to talk because I'll say something and I'll be like what I didn't say, I'm going to say it now. Because how can I not? In a moment, poof, we will become the after party. Someone's going to get bingo.
Yep.
I'm nice that way. Anyway, Annie, I don't know if you want to add anything as we segue out.
Yeah, I was just going to say, if you are leaving Facebook and coming over to NCHE to find this link to join the after party, keep that tab open, because sometime today the link will go live for NCHE's Equity Festival, and you can register. It's a free event that they've been hosting, and John wanted to make sure everybody knew that that registration link was going up today on the NCHE page.
Very much worth checking out.
Yep. All right. Well, the chat is lit up today.
I can tell. I can't keep up with the chat. There's stuff going on there. Every once in a while, I'm like looking, and I know it's like